Snow fell in a whispering veil over Winterfell, shrouding stone and timber and face alike, softening edges that had once been as sharp as the voices in its halls. It came like breath on the neck, a cold murmur that layered the ramparts, muffled the distant grind of wheels, swallowed the clink of armor. Beyond the battlements, the plain stretched white to a line of black firs and the bluish haze of the long northern night. And in that frost-blue distance, men said, something older than men had already begun to move. Until it reached the walls, there was work. Carts of dragonglass blades rattled through the yard. Smoke rushed from the forges. Dogs yelped and were hushed. Torches blazed in an ordered constellation across the walls. Above it all, the weirwood in the gods would kept its guileless watch, its white bark streaked with the slow tears of sap. Jon stood beneath it with his palm pressed to the heart tree's bark, feeling the wood's ridged coolness against the skin of his hand. He had told the old gods his truths 1,000 times before, in whispers, in thought, in curses muttered to the dark, and tonight they seemed as still with them as they were with the snow. He didn't believe they answered, not in words, but he believed they kept a record in some deep ring across which no axe would bite. His breath plumed and vanished. He heard, distantly, the low rumble of dragons. He had been told the truth that afternoon, in the crypt where the dead Starks lay in stony patience and the lamplight ran along chiseled names. Sam had come down with his eyes burning, raw as if he'd been forged himself, and said in his blundering rush of honesty, Rhaegar and Lyanna, marriage, annulment, a babe named Aegon. Bran had been beside him with his empty eyes and terrible calm. It had felt like stepping from solid ice onto a lake without sound and finding the water already open beneath him. He had stood dumb as stone and then, because Sam needed it, he had gone to him and held him when Sam's voice broke on the news of his father and brother. Later, the overwhelming strangeness had come flooding up, the eyes of everyone he had ever known rearranged in his mind, the way they had looked at him if he had been someone else all along. Snow had fallen then too. It felt like a covenant or else a burial. The crackle of frost underfoot made him turn. Torchlight showed her first. A gleam of gold and pale hair under a fur-lined hood. A face that had seen cities burn and desert suns rise. She had not brought many with her. Jorah Mormont kept respectful distance and Missandei turned away at the edge of the trees with Grey Worm beside her like a carved obsidian statue. Daenerys stepped into the godswood with the quiet assuredness of someone who thought herself unwelcome but would not be turned. The red of the heart tree was reflected in her eyes, or else it was something of that same red within them. You left the feast early, she said. He had left before there was any feast to speak of. Winterfell had offered bread and meat and warmth, but not fulsome welcome, and the day had been crowded with headaches. Jaime Lannister's arrival and the weight of his crimes like a yoke about him. The murmurs in hallways when the North saw golden hair and lion pin lodged in a spot where their anger could comfortably land. Jon had watched Brienne stand to defend Jaime with the steadiness of a winter field and had felt something like gratitude for her. He had also watched Dany watch the room watch her, stone by stone, and known that some bridges would never be built, no matter how many planks were thrown. I didn't feel like eating, he said. She drew near enough that he could see the strands of hair caught against the fur of her hood. The dragon's distant sounds were like the deep breathing of mountains. You found rest then? She asked. The question was gentle, familiar in its way. The language of two people who had shared hunger and danger and wind on skin, who had flown above glaciers like riders on the world's spine. He had flown today for the first time, and it had been a kind of thanksgiving. Rhaegal had taken him with a jolt of understanding so startling it had felt like a shout. When they came down to earth, his knees had been water and his mouth full of air. No, he said, and he looked back up at the face in the tree because it was easier than looking at her and because he would have rather confessed anything to the dead than failed the living. There's something I need to say. About what? A flicker of wariness, a gathering of reins. She had not lived this long by leaving herself unguarded. My father, he said, and the old reflex, the old word, felt like betrayal on his tongue. He forced himself through it. Ned Stark. A softness came and went in her. He was true, she said. To what he believed, he was true. He was true enough to keep a promise, Jon said. The snow found its way through his hair, melted and wet his scalp. He did not wipe it away. To his sister, he told the world I was his bastard to keep me alive. Breath hung between them like steam from a kettle. And then her eyes sharpened, widened, softened again, moving through disbelief and into some other territory. She had learned to read men's faces as if they were pages, but he had learned to show very little of what he felt to the world. To her he had shown more. "Who are you saying you are?" she said, and it was not a demand so much as a carefully placed foot upon uncertain ground. "Rhaegar Targaryen married Lyanna Stark," he said, and the names tasted like fruit he had only seen in memory, like something he had thought was a story once and now learned was a lineage. There was an annulment, a secret wedding, a child. She died bringing me into the world. She gave me to her brother, and he kept me as his son. Not for shame, for safety. A boy that might have had a better name died on the Trident. I was given another. Stars were a faint frost H. A's as aloof as they had always been. The trees around them listened and did nothing. Daenerys did not move. He watched his words strike her, watched them change her, even as she tried to hold a surface calm. "Who told you this?" "Bran," he said. "He sees things no one else sees." And Samwell Tarly. He read the records in the Citadel from a high septon's hand. "My father, Rhaegar, had the first marriage set aside and married my mother. I am, if the paper's true, if the eyes are true, I am Aegon Targaryen, your brother's son." He could see how she marshaled her arguments, how the battlefield assembled behind her eyes. He had been in councils with her long enough to recognize the order of her mind when it went to war. It was not madness, whatever the North whispered. It was determination honed to a fatal edge. "Bran is your brother," she said, but there was no bite in the word, only the strangeness of pronouncing a name that was unfamiliar to her tongue. "And this Sam loves you." They could be mistaken. They could be swayed. How convenient for Sansa, for the North, if the man who bent the knee to me is more than he said. How convenient for them if I have a rival they did not ask for. He expected the hurt, and it came blunt as an axe. "Why would I tell you then?" he said, and the words poured out because he had been holding them back against a dam. "If I wanted a claim, I would have kept silent. I told you because it's the truth, and I can't carry it alone. You deserve to know what you've been to me, who I have been to you. I bent the knee because I believed in you. That hasn't changed. I don't want a crown. I don't even know how to want one." Her mouth parted as if to laugh at that, at the black absurdity of the gods and their games. There was no laughter left in her. She had a way of stillness that could be mistaken for marble. It was iron. He thought of all the men who had demanded things of her, and of all the things she had sworn not to give. She, too, had come to a godswood once, and begged for a truth that would not be given her at the time. He had not been there, but he could see it, the way she looked when she asked a world that had gone mad for a reason to continue. "Aegon," she said, testing the name on him, listening to what it did to the air. "It makes you my," she paused. "My blood." "Your nephew," he said. The reflexive apology in him for existing took offense at the way the word dragged. "It makes what we are, more complicated." She gave him a look he couldn't read, some mixture of confusion and a swift calculation of possibility, and then abruptly she exhaled and the steam of it drifted like a banner and vanished. When she spoke, she sounded older than her years and deserts and names. "When my father was born, the world had already decided who we were. Targaryens wed Targaryens, placed us apart. It also destroyed us. This is the truth of my house as much as any coin that flips and flips. In my time east, I learned that there are truths and then there are what truths are for. If this is your truth, then it is also mine. There are men and women huddling against these walls who will die if we fracture tonight." "We won't," he said. He wanted to reach for her and held back, as if his hands had become clumsy in the cold. "We can't. Not now. If I die tomorrow or the night after, or in a week, I didn't want you to hear my name from Varys' whisper or Sansa's anger. I wanted you to hear it from me. I have known whispers all my life, Daenerys said. They've tried to make me smaller than they are. But this I will not have turned into a blade against me at my back. If this is true, he caught the word if like a thrown knife. It is. She took the cut, nodded once as if granting that the blow had landed, and then a glint came into her eyes that had nothing to do with the torchlight. Then the dragon knows its own. That is not a sentence for a winter night. That is a thing that can be tested. He thought of the way Regal had taken him into the sky like a father's hand raising a child to see over the crowd, and some of the tension went out of him. He already has. Dany watched him, and the watch was not unkind. Then it does not matter for now what records say. I will not let the North use this against me. If you do not want a throne, tell them so. I will, he said, and he meant it as he had meant his vows to the Night's Watch, and he knew that sometimes vows were graves you kept to lie in. After the living have what breath they can take. Then we agree, she said. She held his gaze for a long moment, then reached and put her gloved fingers against the back of his hand on the bark of the heart tree. It was not a lover's touch. It was a pact. Do not let anyone else learn of this for now if you can help it. Sansa will not keep it to herself if she thinks it useful. I will tell her, he said. He would not lie to his sister. He would not lie to any of them. He realized with a muted, sparking dread that truth had always been his ruin and his grace. And Arya, and Bran, but he knows everything before words. Beyond that, no one. Not Tyrion? She asked. He is yours, Jon said. Let him be your counsel in this. If you tell him, I will not contest it. But I won't tell him before you do. I won't be the one to put doubt in your ranks. Her mouth moved. It might have been gratitude. It might have been a lesson learned too late for too many. Tomorrow we will speak to the lords and set the last of the plans. It comforts them to speak strategy like prayers. After that, there is nothing left but the thing itself. Then tonight is nothing but the truth, he said. And when he leaned forward, she met him halfway, and the kiss was a human thing in a night that felt like the edge of a fiction too large to be contained by people. Neither of them said what they had learned to say to walls and followers and slaves. I will break the wheel. I will. Save the North. The godswood would have laughed if it could, or the noise of the snow down the branches would have drowned their words anyway. In the morning, Winterfell woke to its tasks like a beast that had been put in harness and did not mind the wait so long as it pulled toward a purpose. The night had emptied the town's barrels of tallow for torches. Sweaty boys ran armloads of fresh molded candles from the storehouses to the smithies and to the halls. The yard was a jitter of sparring and shouted corrections. Brienne cheered Podrick's footwork, and his breath came in white bursts as he parried. Ser Davos' hands were burned and bandaged from carrying hot iron at the forge, but he oversaw the lines of children sturdy enough to lift ladles of stew, and his voice found each woman with a child at her hip and promised, in its way, that men had made plans from worse than this and not lost. In the great hall, the morning council began. It was colder in the hall than outside, the cold caught in the stones. The table was a map of the field marked out in river stones, cut bits of wood and chalk. Dany stood at the head, hair braided tightly. Jon stood not at her shoulder but across from her. Between them lay the plan they had folded and refolded through the night. Bran, borne in on his chair, seemed a small boy swallowed by furs. The sight of him was always a shock to those who had not learned him. They watched his face as if it would change and tell them he was someone they recognized. Sansa stood behind him, elegance drawn tight as a bowstring in the way she held her hands. Arya leaned a shoulder against a pillar and watched from under the fringe of hair that shadowed her eyes like the wing of a bird. The Hound stood a pace aside with Beric Dondarrion, who had been ash-smeared for so long it seemed part of him now. Jorah Mormont was on Dany's left and Grey Worm on her right. Tyrion had come with tight lips and cordial eyes. Varys and Missandei stood like a note written in a script no one else could read. Gendry had the smell of the forge on him and smudges he had forgotten to wipe. He kept glancing between Arya and the map with the split concentration of a man who finds himself in a song and doesn't know the words yet. The plan remains the same in its bones, Dany said. She did not slam fists or pound the table. She had learned that people heard her better when she did not. Bran will be where the Night King must come if he wants what he came for. The Godswood's walls will be fortified as much as they can be. Theon Greyjoy and those he chooses will guard him there. She looked at Theon as if acknowledging a debt none could pay in coin. The Unsullied will hold the line at the trenches. The Dothraki will not charge into a darkness that cannot be seen. They will strike on the flanks when fire allows it. The catapults will be positioned behind the first trench, not before it. When you fire, you will fall back. Do not waste stones in the first brunt. She looked to Jon. It was more than deference. It was choreography. He read his cue and stepped in. We light the trench early, he said. Not as a last resort. Fire hurts them. It will slow them, not stop them. The storm he brings will make flight difficult, but we keep the dragons close. No chasing into the sky until we've seen him with our eyes. The dragons should guard the Godswood until he shows himself. If he doesn't, they'll focus on the breaches where the dead are getting through. Close, not over the field. We can't afford to lose sight of one another. Melisandre had not yet appeared in the hall or at the gates. She would come when Red Gods fancied, and he was not sorry she wasn't in the room. There were already enough gods for the day. He caught Sansa's eye. She didn't move, but something in her attention softened a fraction, as if she approved of the trenches lit sooner than later. The people, she said. Where? In the main hall, Ser Davos said. He had a voice that bargained. Not the crypts. Not the crypts, Sansa said, and her eyes swept the old men around the map. She did not say what she was thinking, that the crypts were full of stark bones, and what good was a sealed door if the one they faced could unmake the seal in the marrow. Bran looked at his folded hands as if the ridges of finger bone were unfamiliar instruments. We will keep the hall sealed and guarded by the men too old for the line, and women who can draw a bow. 10 men at each side door, 20 at the main. Tormund Giantsbane thumped the table with a hand the size of a ham. I like your fire, he announced, and grinned at Brienne in a way that would have been boyish if he were not a great slab of scar and beard. But they'll keep coming over it, so we make them pay for every step. If I die tonight, I want their corpse mountain to break my fall. You won't die, Brienne said, and the firmness of it could have been faith in Tormund or the simple refusal to accept the notion of his absence in the world. You'll stand where you're put and do what you do, and so will we. Jaime was there, the stump he had learned long ago to make no excuse for resting quietly on the table. His golden hand like a captured sun set on the wood. He spoke when the room had made small signs of agreement. Dragonglass on the spears of the men in the first 2 ranks, he said. Between each man, one with a shield. When the dead break on the shield men, the spears go over and through. Keep formation. You break, you die. You die, the line breaks. And for God's sake mind the catapults. Don't spend them all at once. Archers on the walls, Sansa added. They'll see better from above. The fires will give you sight lines. Aim for their knees and above if you can't find their eyes. We've precious few arrows with dragonglass on the heads. Do not waste. They gave ground to practicalities, made room for details to ease the mind. Behind the words lay the awareness that there were worse. Knights written down somewhere, but none of them had names and none of them included them. When the council slackened, when men began to rub at their jawlines and look toward the door that would take them back to where they needed to shout or haul or bind, Dany said with a careful casualness, "A word, my lords, my ladies," and she lifted her chin at the members of her small circle. Tyrion saw it first and moved closer, Yora with him. Grey Worm followed because where his queen's eyes went, he went, and Missandei because she kept the clean arithmetic of Dany's meaning. Varys drifted as smoke drifts, to fill the shape of a small space made available. Sansa remained by Bran's chair. Arya remained a shadow, as if no one would think to count her among those who heard. Jon did not look at her, which is how he knew she would not leave. Daenerys spoke softly. "What is said now is not to leave this room," she said. "I have learned the uses of secrets. We fight a war. We do not fight the war that will come after. We will if we survive. I have news that will test all of us, and I want it to have no effect but the one it has on me and on the man it concerns. Is that understood?" Varys' eyes gleamed. "A secret in Winterfell," he said lightly. "What could be more natural?" "I told her last night," Jon said before anyone could begin supposing, because he would not ask Dany to stand before a gauntlet of their curiosity. "Rhaegar Targaryen married Lyanna Stark. They had a son. He is me. Silence is of different kinds, and this one had a weight to it, like a breath held in a lung that had learned the trick of not expelling what it had no right to keep." Tyrion's mouth stayed open a second too long, closed with a soft click. Yora's eyes did not move for a full count of 3, and then they went to Dany as a reflex and stayed there, waiting to learn if the ground beneath them had become air. Varys' body did not change, but the look he gave Jon was immediately measuring. Not the way merchants measure, but the way men measure notches in a doorframe every year and do sums in their heads regarding reach and weight and what a boy might carry if pressed. Tyrion cleared his throat. "Bran and the Citadel ledgers," he said, half to himself. "Reliable as any of our proof in this life. You told the Queen because?" "Because it is hers as much as it is mine," Jon said, willing them to give him credit for what he had to spend. "Because I would not have her fight to save my home while I kept from her a thing that could break alliance later if it comes out sideways. Because if I die tonight I want—" He stopped because suddenly he didn't want to say the thing he wanted. Dany lifted the thought for him, not unkindly. "He wanted me to hear it from him," she said. "And I have. I don't want doubt in the ranks. I do not want to see you glance at him and see a crown where his head ought to be. This battle is not a place for that. We fight for the living. That truth is larger than this one. After it, we will decide what to do with the only coin we have to spend." Sansa's gaze was sharp steel. "The North has paid in blood for other people's coins," she said. "We will speak of that after." It was the nearest she had come to concession since Dany had arrived. It tasted of something like victory to Tyrion, who allowed himself a breath he had not yet taken all day. Arya's expression did not change. "You still my brother?" she said, and when Jon nodded once, she accepted it. "Good," she said. "Then none of this matters, except that you're very hard-headed and might get yourself killed. Try not to. It'd put me in a mood." Outside, the day dragged toward a night so deep it would feel like a tunnel. Men and women moved in their patterns and made their small choices. Gendry found Arya near the forges and pressed a length of cloth into her hands. Inside was the spear she had drawn, dragonglass running the length of it and its tidily engineered shaft to split in the middle. It fit her hand with a familiarity that made something in both of them ease. He said, "I don't know if I can make it prettier than that in the time." And she did something she did rarely. She smiled in a way that showed her teeth. "It'll kill them," she said. "That's what pretty looks like tonight." She moved with it as if answering a question asked long ago. The hound watched her practice and snorted. "You always were too quick," he grunted. "Don't go trying to outrun death. It cheats." "I don't outrun it," she said. And when he blinked, something that might have been a laugh rattled in his throat. Brienne found Jaime in the yard, his breath a smoky rhythm as he worked with Podrick. She corrected Pod's stance, her hand a firm weight on his shoulder, and did not flinch at the older man's regard. He watched her as a pilgrim might watch a holy flame, with something like awe and something like sadness. That night, when the firelight pooled like wine in the great hall, she would kneel and be made something she had been all her life. Theon presented himself to Sansa quietly. There was a scar on him that had never faded and never would, and under that, the boy who had been a man's hostage and a man who had been a boy's shame. She put a hand on his arm and said something no one else heard. It rescued him from something in himself. When evening came, the sky turned not dark but the color of slate rubbed to dullness, and the wind mastered the torches before wind and flame came to terms. Melisandre came on foot out of the night as if the darkness had given her up rather than she had left it. Davos met her with a hand raised as if to halt the tide. She looked at his palm as if reading, then moved past with the relentless inevitability of an avalanche. The flaming of the Araks spread one by one like a summer disease, and the mutter that went through the Dothraki ranks as each blade caught fire was joy and fear braided together. On the wall above, men inhaled an iksha. Lead. The exhale came with steam. The dead came without drum or horn. They came like winter does down a mountain, not slower and not faster than their nature allowed. And the line of them was only visible when it took on the firelight and became a frantic shimmer. The horses in the Dothraki ranks stamped and sang to one another from nostril to nostril. Ghosts slid along the line with tongue lolling and eyes bright and unearthly. Jon had wanted to keep him back with the huddled and weak and had been outvoted by Ghost's nature. "Hold," Dany said, and Drogon's throat trembled under her felt and leather, heat seeping through into her bones. Rhaegal shivered at Jon's heel, restless as a stallion held too long at the bit. There was something like the hum of a beehive in both beasts, as if some old memory in their blood had come alive and was searching a long history for a match to the scent of what came out of the White Night. The signal flamed on the trenches, and the front of the dead met fire and climbed, clumsy and without pain, bodies on bodies. The line did not break. Men behind shields felt weight, then more weight, then too much weight to be borne and bore it. The spears came over and punched forward. The second rank set their feet. When the whites went down they did not cry, and when they burned they did not plead. There was a noise to it, late in the evening. A kind of weeping that might have been the fat that lives in bones finding flame. Catapult stones hurled into an enemy's hedge of flesh and steel, and Ser Davos clicked his tongue and signaled the retreat to the second position. The crews ran the hulks back with practiced misery. Arrows flew and stuck and did a little bit of their small work. Winterfell's walls were not high enough to make archery easy and not low enough to make it a sure thing. Men fell, and women lifted their bows in their places, and arrows flew again. Wildlings howled and hacked, and Unsullied stood as if they had done this all their lives, which many had. Their lives had simply prepared them for a different sort of darkness. On the ground, the Dothraki's fire blades roved and cut like constellations loosed from the sky. They seemed immortal and then sharply mortal, snuffed not one by one but in rash clusters, and the knowledge that fire could go out like that found its way to the throat. There was wind, then more wind, and it was as if the whole of the world had been bent into a bellows and someone had placed a hand upon the handles and squeezed. Snow rose and whirled. Flame guttered and hissed and regained itself. Dany's hair beat against her cheek. Jon held the reins of the saddle with one gloved fist and Rhaegal's ridges with the other and told himself he was worthy of this beast's trust. He listened. Dany raised her hand and signaled to the men who watched the godswood. They lit more braziers there until the grove burned with a circle of gold like a ring on a pale hand. Through the storm, a shape slowly formed. A smear of deeper night, a repetition of absence, and then the glint of an eye like a coin seen under a frozen stream. Viserion, ruined and intact, broke through the cloud like a forgotten god with a new face. His wings were torn but mighty. He breathed a great gout of blue that seemed like ice before it became fire of another sort. When it struck stone, the stone cracked with the high scream of things broken beyond mending. Men flinched, staggered, died without knowing they had. The weirwood's face seemed to blink when the heat hit, though it might have been melting snow finding a path through the red. The Night King rode as if this were the simplest of sports. He held no reins. He took the sky like a fisherman at sea, hunkered and comfortable. Dany banked hard and Drogon reared. Jon pressed with his legs and felt Rhaegal gather. They rose and the storm rose with them. "Not away!" Jon shouted into the wind, the command not to her but to himself, to the old fever that wanted to chase and chase until he was above the world and could finally see the pattern in the madness. Dany looked back just long enough to catch his gaze, then leveled her dragon and kept him low, circling the godswood, circling the gold circle they had made. Below them, Theon and his chosen men took their places like chessmen on a board too small for what it must convey. Bran sat in his chair and did not shiver. The Night King came lower. Perhaps the fire drew him as a moth is drawn. Perhaps he had long since decided not to ride above his prey but to test the burn. Missandei and Grey Worm, on the outer edge of the ring, looked up long enough to see another world moving above them with its own storms. The Night King flicked his hand and the dead surged. The ring of flame bent, then dipped, then sprang higher as more torches were shoved through the slats and oil poured like soup. Theon met the eyes of the man across from him and saw the Iron Islands gray, not quite in the face, but in the willingness to stand until bone or wood broke. Dany raised her hand. Drogon opened his jaw, and the long red breath of him crashed across the Night King and his beast. Blue met red. The fire clung and boiled. The Night King vanished inside it, and the heart of the watching army lifted and suspended, wanting to believe. Then what had looked like cloud found a shape and a figure, and a dragon came through fire as through a curtain, whole and grinning without lips, the ice light rolling off him. She had not known she could feel disappointment so complete and so brief. It didn't sink into her. It skittered and went. Her mind took the information and did with it what it did with all things that the world handed her late. It made a new plan inside of the old plan. "It will not be fire," she said under her breath. "It will be steel." Regal roared a challenge, and the sound of it seemed less like rage and more like recognition. Jon pointed with his body rather than his hand, and they climbed in. Dee turned, stayed not high but higher than the line of the wall. His plan had no word in it for hero. He had learned better. His plan had the word bait and the word reckoning and the word time. On the ground, men died and did not. Those who had learned that death could be a journey with pauses in it fought as if they were defending their own graves. The trenches burned in ellipses of flame, opened for reinforcements, closed again in a hungry clap. Davos' voice found Melisandre's, and the two did not like each other, but they made something workable with their voices. The giant came out of the storm, bigger than the storm, and the first men on the wall to see it made a noise that wasn't fear but was a thing like awe had been turned inside out. Lyanna Mormont planted her feet in the way of the Mormonts and set her jaw, and when she went into the giant's chest with her dragonglass blade, there was a collective inhaling, and when the giant fell there was a hollowness to the cheering, as if everyone knew what he had done to her but argued with the knowledge. Jaime found Brienne in a breach where the bodies were a heap, and the line was a new thing built atop the old. They fought back to back, and their breath interlocked, and he found himself strangely content. If this was to be the end, he had stood beside worse people for worse reasons. Theon's men fell, and the bodies at Bran's feet made a low wall. Theon did not count. He had stopped counting things that hurt him long ago. He had never needed much to stand. He needed this, and it had been given. He looked to Bran and found in the boy's face a small allowance of sorrow, as if Bran were not only a boy but a landscape that had learned to pity the travelers moving through it. The Night King landed at last at the edge of the Godswood, his steps as light as a dancer's. The men left between him and Bran made the noises men made when fear had tilted into something else. He walked as if the world had been made for him and was merely catching up with its purpose. Jon saw him, and something in his blood answered with a ringing, a bell at the back of beyond. He urged Regal lower, and Dany, who had never in her life been good at yielding ground that felt like hers, did the thing he needed and swung Drogon wide, to the north side of the grove, where the line had begun to falter. If the Night King wanted the boy in the chair, he could have him, but he would pay for each step in flame. Jon slid out of the saddle with a clumsy thud and landed hard. His knees jarred. He had not planned to dismount, but plans were in a constant negotiation with the ground. He left Regal there, ruffling and twitching, like a hunter's hound told to hold, and picked up a fallen spear even as he ran. Men around him moved in separate vignettes, leaving streaks of story across the snow. He saw the hound's mouth open to shout, Beric's sword flash, the arm that ended in light and ash raised to bar his way. He saw Arya leap and vanish and reappear and vanish again. He could not see her path, but he would feel it later like a story told to him that he had lived through and missed. Theon charged as if a boy were watching from the parapet. The Night King accepted the charge as if he had been pressing for something to do, and was relieved that at last it had arrived. The spear went through armor and bone and grief and joy and the knowledge of small boats and larger slavers and the eyes of a girl on a gray day. The Night King removed the spear from himself as if it had annoyed him. He raised a hand, and Theon flew back as if the hand had become the wind. He lay as he had lain once on a bed when he had wished he could die and had not been allowed. "You're a good man," Bran said into the space between them. and Theon heard it as if through water and smiled in a way that didn't show in his face. Jon's boots slid on packed blood. He came up at a run, then slower, then at last at that particular speed that belonged to men who had run a long way and remembered suddenly that the last 10 steps were always the longest of a life. The Night King turned toward him and lifted his arm again in what might have been an absent necessity or a habit. The dead around Jon rose, and he stopped as if he had run into a wall. Dany came in low, Drogon's belly almost skimming the ground, and burnt a path through the new dead with a sweep that was as precise as it could be in the madness. Jon jumped through the hot hole that opened before it closed. The Night King's gaze found him across a stretch of snow without footprints in it and did not alter. He did not raise his sword. He did not do anything that acknowledged Jon's pulse. If there was cruelty in him, Jon could not see it. If there was joy, it was a thing like a star too far to draw heat from. The steel in Jon's hand had a name, and he had learned that names mattered. He had also learned that the dead did not care about the history of men's words. They cared about the thing a blade could do to their story. He circled left. The Night King seemed content to let him. It would be a child's game if the child had learned it from a wolf and a shadow. It happened quickly, as such things do after they have taken their time taking shape. Arya coming as if out of the wind, the dagger a small piece of winter caught in a fist. She flew, and all that she was flew with her. The hours behind a smithy, the night under a dead girl's face, the words whispered to a god that was only a mirror. The Night King turned and saw her and moved with a speed that had nothing to do with life or death but merely with inevitability. His hand caught her by the throat mid-flight and the other caught her wrist. The dagger fell and then did not, because the thing that learned had learned to let its weapon move the way water moves along a stone and find the hand that waited for it. She caught it in the other hand and put it where it needed to go. The world made a noise like a string pea, yuled too tight snapping. It sang backward. The dead fell like flowers suddenly uprooted, and the Night King came apart as if he had never been one thing, only pieces held together by a cold idea. The storm broke itself against nothing and scattered. It was just air again, blowing through trees. For a long time, the people of the living made small sounds not worthy to be called speech because the mouths that made them had been used for other things all night. Then there were cheers, and then there were screams, and then there were the kinds of sobbing that put people on their knees. Drogon landed like a house laid down to rest, and Dany slid from the saddle with shaking legs. Jon's knees gave once and he found them again, then crossed the last distance to Bran and Arya and Theon and put his hand on Arya's head, as if she were still the girl who had run snarling at boys too old to be fighting her and cut them anyway. Bran looked at him as if through glass, and then as if through nothing. "We did what needed doing," he said. "Neither gods nor crows do more than that." Theon was dying. He had not died yet because his body was taking time to do it properly. Sansa came and knelt, and he met her look, and there was no shame left at all in his face, only thanks. She took his hand, and when he breathed out once more, it was not with fear in it. They carried the day like something too heavy for one person to carry, and they carried it to the morning. The sun came up pale and narrow, striping the clouds with color like blood watered and spilled in thaw. Fire ate what could be burned, and men sharpened blades for the work of mercy that remained. Those too hurt to walk were washed and bound if binding would save them. If not, they were whispered to and otherwise left alone to conduct business with whatever gods they had brought with them to the field. Ghost limped, very pleased with himself, and laid his head on Jon's thigh as if he could put back whatever piece had fallen out of him in the night. The hall filled with grief and meat and children's sleep. There was no speech that did not come from the heart because there was no necessity for the other kind. When the cups lifted that night, it was for the living because the dead did not need wine. Men praised Arya until she squirmed. She did not like it. She liked the knife cleaned and placed back in its sheath. She went outside as soon as she could, to practice the shape of the move until it left her body, because she did not want it to live in her forever. Dany watched from the dais where she had agreed to sit not alone but beside Jon because anything else would have begun to look like policy. The North watched them with a mixture of complex arithmetics unfolding in their minds. Sansa watched too, and her mouth made a thin line. Jon talked to men whose names he had learned on the eve of the war. He laughed once, and the sound of it made Dany look at him. He did not laugh often, but when he did it was like the thaw coming into a river. It carried broken ice with it and still made room for the sound of water. Varys came to her after the hall had begun to empty and the piles of bones showed on platters and the fire had eaten the best of the wood. His face was mild and his voice gentle and sly. He spoke of gratitude and then of the future as if there were a natural segue between them. Tyrion came too, but later, when he had drunk just enough to feel brave and not enough to feel foolish. Yora hovered and said nothing that needed saying. "It may be that your vow to each other is enough," Varys said, rolling the polished stone of the idea between his palms, feeling its weight. He does not want the crown, but people often want for others what they do not wish for themselves. They might wish it on him anyway. The North would be soothed by the thought of a Stark on a throne. The South would be rebuked by the sight of a conqueror who brings winter and then harvest. "I am not a conqueror tonight," Dany said. "I am a woman who kept 1,000 people alive long enough to bury their dead. Will you not let me be that for one evening?" He bowed slightly. Varys could disarm. "All my evenings are yours, my queen," he said. "I only hope for the day after tomorrow." He drifted away again like a dream from which a person wakes more tired than they went to sleep. Tyrion lingered and looked at the wood grain of the table as if it were a puzzle he had almost solved. "You asked me once if I'd ever believed in good kings," he said. "I said very little. I will say this. People tend to rally better behind two people than one. Something in them likes the image of balance. The opposite of a coin, if you like. A scale." "You mean marriage," she said. He did not look up immediately, and when he did, his eyes were very sober. "I mean a promise that the realm can hear as well as the two of you. You would be better together. Your worst impulses cancel one another's out. Your best ones add up. It does not even need to be a marriage of passion." He smiled faintly. "In my experience, those rarely last when they're needed most." She thought of the slight war in her at the idea of the North's democracy of family and Umber's yelling at Manderleys and the unbending courtesy of Stark women. She thought of the dragon in her that wanted to break all things that were old simply because they were old, and of the impulse that had guarded her hand on the lever of a wheel. She thought of Jon in the Godswood with snow in his hair. "You and Varys are at your work." "We never stop," Tyrion admitted. "That is how we survive. If you want the living to survive the next war, you must think like us. Better yet, make our thinking part of a larger, better thought. You are the only person I know who could do that." When Jon came to her in the quiet after, he smelled of smoke and dog and snow, and she realized she had begun to like that combination as if it were a thing that made sense at last. "Sansa will not like it," he said at once, because he could not be happy without looking for the place where happiness would be denied. "Sansa wants the North free. She has good reasons." "Let us argue with her reasons," Dany said, "not her fear. If I ask you to stand with me and prove to her that what we make will be better than what we break, will you? If it spares the people left the sight of another burned city," he said, and the words made his face change, because he had just learned something about what frightened him most. "Yes, the city is not burned," she said softly. "Not yet. This is the power I want for us, that we can end wars with as little fire as we can bear. It is not mercy. It is wisdom, and mercy's cousin. Varys and Tyrion have suggested what you are thinking." He rubbed at his forehead as if the thought could be smoothed down like unruly hair. "To marry." He looked at her, and it was not with lust, though he felt it and knew it, but with the sort of regard men give the ocean when it has not drowned them yet. "You are my aunt." "I have been many things," she said. "You have been many things. The North will not like the word for what we are. But the North also likes not being dead. And the Targaryens have done this to themselves for longer than the North has had complaints to recite. I will ask you this. Do you believe it would make the realm less cruel to do this?" He thought of the crypts and the stories he had overheard down there as a boy. He thought of Robb's crown and the way it had looked in his hands, wrong as a sword held by the wrong hilt. "Yes," he said simply. "If we make one thing simple for them, maybe they will forgive that others are not." "Then ask me," she said, with a spark in her voice that was not mockery and not a command. He looked at her and found the courage he had learned to store for use in moments when he did not especially want to be brave. "Will you marry me?" "I already have," she said, meaning the battle line they had stood on together. And then she watched the way his eyes changed and added, "Yes." He went to Sansa first because betrayal would be to go to her last. He found her where the wind made a thin sound through the murder holes and her hair blew in the draft as if it were trying to leave her and would not quite. He told her. She closed her eyes a moment and opened them again like shutters. Arya stood off to one side, tugging at the wrap on her hand where the Night King's fingers had closed and left bruises that were already fading. "You think it will save us?" Sansa's tone was not incredulous. It was something more like exhaustion dressed up in the clothes of disbelief. "I think it will save others," he said. "The North will not love her, but they don't need to love her. They need to know that I stand beside her and that she will protect them. I cannot promise King's Landing will be kind when we go south, but we can make it as least cruel as possible. We can crush Cersei without crushing the world. You know what cruelty looks like when it smiles." Sansa looked across a gulf only she could bridge. "And the North's freedom?" "After," he said, "or during, we will hammer out something that allows your people to breathe. There is a way for an old order to change without a pyre made of everyone's houses. I'll not hold a crown over you and call it a gift. If I am to be a bridge, I'll be one with more than a single plank." "That is not how the world has gone," she said, and because it had to be said she said it, and because she was not the girl she had been, she did a hard thing. "But you are who you are. I would trust you with my life and my children's lives, if I had any. I do not trust her. If you make this marriage, you put my trust in your keeping twice over. Don't break it." "I won't," he said. "If I do, take my head." Arya snorted softly. "You'd hate being headless," she said. "You have a good head. Don't put her on a leash either. She'll chew through it and bite your hand." "Noted," he said, and something very like love, which had always been in him but had not often found ways to be said, went through his voice. They set out for the south after the pyres were nothing but ash that blew on heels and spurred hounds. The dead had been burned and the living sent to bed, and some had slept and some had not. The ravens had flown. The message had gone ahead of them. Cersei had finished her wine and poured another. At the winter-drab edges of the riverlands, they paused to restring the army around the points of a new shape. The men who had stood beside Jon in the snow warmed to the idea of a wedding more than they had to the idea of a queen who did not smile at them unless they had just sworn. The Dothraki did not especially care either way. The Unsullied did not care in any visible way at all. The men of the Vale who had arrived late but still in time to say they had fought felt that as long as someone told them where to stand and paid them, they would do the work. There was a sense in the air among the common soldiers that if two extraordinary people could make a promise, then it might be that promises meant something again. Brienne rode beside Jaime with a care that did not show as overprotectiveness but did not have to. It was there, in the way she watched the Treleans and the way he did not make a joke and so spared them both. Podrick sang under his breath a tune he had picked up in the hall, and it moved through the column like an itch, catching and being suppressed and catching again. Gendry did sums with hammers and nails and thought of Storm's End and what a name meant. Arya did not think about names. She watched the road for whoever would die upon it and refrained from offering her services to the gods because she had already paid them, and she knew gods. They would take whatever coin you placed before them and ask for more. Near Harrenhal, scouts brought word of a fleet at Dragonstone and of Scorpion's Tea. Hat had multiplied like a bad idea. In another world, in a slightly different telling of the story in which Dany had not been made to turn her dragons into a single spear, Rhaegal would have died screaming into the sea, and she would have learned something that night that would have been of no use to her later because it would have come too late. In this story, Jon and Dany heard and looked at their map and made a line not toward the sea but inland, and their ships were ordered to hug the coast until they joined with them further south where the cliffs softened. Euron Greyjoy watched a horizon that gave him no dragons that day and spat a curse and broke a cup. They met with the Golden Company on a field chewed to mud by hooves. The company looked as if it had never bled, which was the point of it and also its lie. Arrangements were made, words exchanged, and in the dark that night Varys spoke to a man who had once been an ally, and told him that gold shines more convincingly on a living man than a dead one. In the morning, the company's officers walked away from their picket lines with their hands empty, and the rest of the army made no sudden moves, and the banners turned by increments and then all at once. Missandei did not die on a wall that afternoon because she was never captured, because there were more eyes on the roads and more minds turning toward the business of the South than simply the hunger to get the thing over with. She rode with Grey Worm through fields that had been fought over since men learned to fight, and found her way back to a strip of sand she had once told Dany about. "If we win," she had said long ago. "If we live." Now she could say it to herself without hitting the iron bars in her throat. At the Trident's Ford, an envoy met them, Qyburn, the patience of a spider in a dry season. He made his case for a speech on walls and a battle in streets and an honorable ending. Tyrion told him that he had never seen honor run so clean from a body as it did from Qyburn's. He did not get the laugh he may have thought the line deserved. He did not need it. Qyburn went back into the city, and Cersei drank her wine and looked at her maps and said, "Let them try." The dragon pit was where they ended, because men like to end things where they remember beginning them, even if it was a beginning that contained too much disappointment. Dany and Jon stood together, and the heat beat up from the stones as if the monsters buried under the city breathed and could not be made to stop. Cersei wore a crown like something sharp and wrong and raised a hand, and perhaps the signal would have come then. Perhaps the wildfire would have taken, if someone had convinced her there could be victory without ruin. But Jaime had left her, and Euron had wandered back to sea like men do when a shore grows too crowded, and the men before her were not looking at her with the eyes she understood. Dany had made a promise, and promises chained her. She said it aloud, for the city and for the men with the scorpions on the walls and the children who peered through shutters and the women who cut bread. "I am Daenerys of House Targaryen," she said. "I have been a slave and a queen. I have put chains on men and taken them off. I have burned cities and I have spared them. I am tired of winter. I am tired of tyrants whose names rhyme with one another." The laugh came that time, unwanted, and made its way through the crowd because it carried something they needed to hear. Jon stood with her and did not smile. He did not do much at all but exist in the place that told the city that this was not only a dragon's queen but something that might outlast desire. When he spoke, he had Davos cadence without the salt. "Lay down your arms," he said. "Open your gates. You'll live. If you do not, you may die. My sisters taught me that words do not do much to a blade when it's swinging. Do what makes sense. We have had enough stupidity for a lifetime." It was not elegant. It worked because men do not need poetry when they are calculating breath. Cersei did not open her gates. Of course she did not. But the scorpions on the walls did not fire until they were ordered. And the order did not come because the men holding the cords did sums of their own and the numbers came out wrong. The gates did not swing inward at once but in increments, and the increments became enough of an opening for the first wave to go in, and once the first wave had gone in, it was hard to keep the second out. Dany kept Drogon on a high tether and did not loose fire except where there were lines of men with scorpions and no one under them who would burn for their folly. Jon kept himself on the ground and did the thing he had always done best, which was endure. In the end, it was not a magnificent victory. It was something else. Untidy, ashamed of itself, almost gentle. Cersei did not die in the way bards would have liked to sing about. She fled as a rat flees and found herself in a passage where the city had betrayed her and the stones stopped knowing her name. She died under them, not because the sky fell but because a certain length of wall had been cut too cheaply long ago. Qyburn's neck broke when a man shoving past found him in his way. The people spilled into streets and did not spit on Dany when she rode and did not reach for her, either afraid still, curious always. She stopped where the road split because cities like King's Landing are nothing but decisions made in their hundreds, and when she did, the forward movement of the whole army changed with her. Jon sat his horse and watched the gawping of boys and the way a woman with a baby sagged with relief as if she had been holding her urine too long and had finally been allowed to go. The bells rang because someone pulled their ropes, and because bells ring when enough hands think that ringing a bell will keep a building from burning down. When it was done, it was not done. There were rooms to see, and men to find crouched behind doors, and chaos to manage with 100 hands and a mind that did not want to reach so far and had to. But it was not ash. There was no snow in the city. The air smelled of old kitchens and hot stones. They were wed in the great September scar, in a circle drawn where the old walls had been replaced with prayer and will. There were no gods there worth the name, only people who had decided to do a beautiful thing in a place where a beautiful thing had once died. Sansa wore winter on her shoulders. Arya bore no sword, which was a kindness. Bran did not smile, but the line of his face softened. Davos stood where a father might have stood for men who had none. Tyrion fucked up his speech and then caught it midair and made it so good even he laughed at the parts of it that were not meant to be funny. Varys watched and put his calculations away. Not because he had finished them, but because sometimes some ceased to be the important thing. Jorah watched and held his queen and did not die for once in the night, which is what he had felt he had done every day since he had become a man. Dany's hand in Jon's was warmer than his. It would always be so. When they said their vows, they asked each other for nothing they were not already giving and promised nothing that was not snapped into place by steel. After, they walked the city together. They found the places where the rubble still stank of last year's sun and this morning's blood. They put money in bowls. They listened to petitions for wells. They learned a dozen ways to say bread. In the north, snow melted reluctantly in ruts that had been pressed by the feet of an army, and Winterfell stones warmed under a spring that came earlier than anyone had predicted. Sansa sent for masons and builders and joked with them without warmth and without cruelty. She carved out a sentence in slow words that men understood, and it was this: "You will be left alone long enough to plant and reap. You will be left alone long enough to bury your dead in the earth, not in your house. You will be left alone with your gods." She carved out another sentence for the south and sent it with a seal: "We will be your friends and allies. We will not be your vassals." It was a new arrangement because everything worth keeping is new the first time it is made. Arya learned that her feet still took her to doorways and rooftops and that her hands itched for the weight of a blade. And she learned that a person can choose to love other things more than an itch. She sailed on a gray morning and looked for what lay west of everything. Men had always said there was nothing there, but men said too many things. She set her bowl on the deck and watched the foam gather and dissipate and told herself a story about what kinds of gods lived on a sea where the sun never sank because it lacked an edge to slide down. Brienne took command of a patrol and wrote oaths with Podrick in the training yard and learned to run a household's accounts without ever once sitting down to knit. Jaime watched her do all this and realized that there had been a knight inside of him all along that had nothing to do with the gold of his hand. He lost the need to talk about it and found that in losing that need, he was easier in his step. Missandei went to Noth with Grey Worm and watched the butterflies come early that year. They brought salt with them and knew how to use it. They brought Midasosi doctors who knew the way to brew herbs into a damp cloth that made a bite's fever drop before it took. They stayed because the idea of staying had been a kind of music in them for so long they could not stop humming it. Tyrion learned the city's paperwork as if it were a lover he had misjudged at first. He read petitions. He invented ways to keep the sewers from planting their musk in the alleys. He made poor jokes and excellent laws. He stood in the shade when it was too hot and in the sun when it was too cold. Varys did not stop whispering. He did it less for affection than for necessity, which suited him. Dany and Jon ruled, one with fire well banked and the other with snow that had learned to thaw when it ought. They fought and made up and fought again without ever turning their fighting into policy. They received small envoys with faces like paper who came from far corners. Dorne, now ready to say yes to something for the first time in decades. The Iron Islands as grudging as ever. The Westerlands sleek as cats. They had a son and named him something that had not been spoken with weight for a long time. They had a daughter and she did not cry the first hour of her life. And Jon laughed because it had been like fighting a tiny, determined wildling and he knew her already for herself. When people came to the capital and stood in front of them to ask for things, most turned their eyes to Jon first because he had the face the North understood and the voice the South could translate. Dany did not mind it. She had not come for eyes. She had come for hands, very many hands, working together until the things she had once destroyed had grown back and did not look like what they had been before. She kept the dragons. She took them to the skies sometimes and turned their shadows over fields so men would look up and remember that fear can be a tool and so can awe. She taught herself the art of using both sparingly. She taught herself to sleep when she could. Once, in a night of high summer when the moon had bled onto the river like milk, she woke to find Jon watching her. He looked afraid and she reached for him with an old tenderness. "What is it?" she asked. "In the Godswood, when I told you who I was," he said, as if taking the first step on a path she had long since thought gone. "I thought the world was going to end no matter how we fought. It's not ended. I don't know what to do with the rest of it." "We live," she said simply, because the old words were sometimes the only ones if any worth. "We do not pretend the dead did not happen. We do not pretend that our hands did not do things we regret. We tell the truth. We do not tell it when saying it will put a knife in a good plan. We do not lie to each other. We live." He kissed her with his fear still in him. He never lost it, not entirely. Where it did not lift, it lay down like a dog that had learned to come when called. In the north, snow went on falling in winters and melt happened when it should. In the south, fruit swelled on trees in the right season and the wrong season only when it had been asked to by men with clever grafting and woman's hands. The bells rang each year for the first harvest and for the first frost. The dead had their days and the living had theirs. Some nights, after the water in the bath had cooled and the city's clamoring had softened into the tender grumbling of people in their beds, they sat at the table in their rooms with the maps spread between them, as if maps were not the sort of instrument that sometimes put distance between people who should sit close. Jon would set down a cup with wine still in it and put his finger on a square that once had said Winterfell simply and now had a longer name. He would trace the line to the sea. Dany would listen like someone listening to weather, alert for the gust and the lull. They would talk of taxes and of poets' stipends and of the rebuilding of a sept that would not be used for burning. They would say, from time to time, "Do you remember?" and then not say the thing because it would be enough to look and know that they did. Above them the dragons slept one huddled against another, massive as houses, breathing heavily with whatever dragons dream. Below them the city breathed too, in and out, in and out. Somewhere beyond all that, in a west Arya was learning like an alphabet. The sea woke and slept, woke and slept. In the Godswood, which had never learned how to be south, a face in a tree did not change, but the sap quickened in spring all the same. The record kept itself in rings. The snow fell. The snow melted. The truth remained like a blade kept honed, not because it was always needed, but because a dull one will betray you when at last it is called upon. There were men who wrapped themselves in other stories and women who slipped out of names like cloaks when they needed to. There were those who expected madness of a queen and those who had built their lives around the idea a bastard might serve them better than their own sons. There were those who believed in destiny and those who did not. Years later, Jon went back north to a winter that had come honestly, without magic behind it. He stood beneath the Godswood and pressed his hand to the trunk as he had that night and felt the same ridges under his palm. The old gods did not speak. The wind did. It said, "You told the truth once when it was weight and not weapon. You paid for it. You are not owed gratitude. No one is. But there are those alive who would not have been, and there are those not ash who would have been ash." Jon took his hand away and stood very still. He could hear sleds moving, children shrieking briefly before they remembered their dignity. He could smell wood smoke. He could taste snow. He turned, and in the distance a dragon's shadow passed over the bare branches as the beast sailed toward him, lazy in its old age and enormous still, the sound of its wings low and impatient. He smiled, a little. He had never belonged to one name alone. He had learned to live as if he did, because that is what the living do when faced with the scale of the world. They pick a way to call themselves and step into it and keep walking until they reach the place where the road bends and the name has to bend with it. He raised a gloved hand. The dragon circled once above the heart tree, sending snow from its branches in a dew that could have been a blessing or simple accident. Either way it fell, both were true, and he laughed into the cold air and then turned his face up to watch the sky.